Good morning. For today, I'm going to take up lungs, and the topic outline would cover the following. We're going to talk about congenital anomalies, atelectasis, pulmonary edema, acute lung injury, ARDS, different obstructive and restrictive lung diseases, diseases of vascular origin, pulmonary infection, lung transplantation, tumors, and also diseases of the pleura. To start with, let us first try to review the normal anatomy. The trachea developed into two lateral outpacketings, which we call as the lung buds. It actually divides into the right and the left. The right lung bud divides into three branches, and the left divides into two main bronchi, giving rise to three lobes on the right and two lobes on the left. The right main stem bronchus is more vertical and more directly in line with the trachea than the left. So it is almost always that foreign material will lodge the right lung rather than the left lung. Accompanying the branching airways is the double arterial blood supply of the lungs. We have the pulmonary and bronchial arteries. The difference microscopically will be as follows. The bronchioles lack cartilage and submucosal glands within their walls. The sinus is spherical and the diameter is approximately around, as it is stated here, 7 millimeters. A cluster of 3 to 5 terminal bronchioles, each with its appended asinus, is usually referred to as pulmonary lobule. From the microscopic standpoint, except the vocal cords, which are covered by stratified squamous epithelium, the entire respiratory tree, including the larynx, trachea, and bronchioles, is lined by pseudostratified tall columnar ciliated epithelium admixed with cartilage, containing mucin-secreting goblet cells. So this is an illustration, again, of the microscopic feature. Bear in mind that from the microscopic standpoint, except the vocal cords, which are covered by stratified columnar epithelium, the entire respiratory tree is supposed to be lined by pseudostratified tall columnar epithelium. We're going to look at the alveolar septa. So we have the different structures. The first here is what we call as capillary endothelium. So this is your blood vessel. It is lined by endothelial cells. The endothelial cells are basically composed of anastomosing capillaries. Next to it would be your basement membrane and the surrounding interstitial tissue, which separates the endothelial cells from the epithelial cells. So again, this is the endothelial side, and this is the epithelial side. In thin portions, the basement membrane of the epithelium and the endothelium are fused, whereas in thicker portions, they are separated by an interstitial space, which we call as pulmonary interstitium. It contains elastic fibers, collagen, interstitial cells, smooth muscle cells, mast cells, and even inflammatory cells like lymphocytes and monocytes. This is what we call as the, again, epithelial side. When we are talking about epithelial side, there are actually two types of pneumocytes that you can see here. The type 1 pneumocyte is otherwise known as membranous pneumocytes. It is flattened and it covers 95% of the alveolar surface. On the other hand, the type 2 pneumocytes are the source of surfactant. They are contained in lamellar bodies and the main cell type, which is involved in the repair of alveolar epithelium after destruction of type 1 cells. You also have what we call as resident alveolar macrophages. They are loosely attached to the epithelial cells or lying free within the alveolar spaces. Now, the first group of anomalies that we're going to take up would be your congenital anomalies. This is something that is then present at the time of birth. Like, for example, pulmonary hypoplasia. As you can see in this illustration, this is the hypoplastic lung. Pulmonary hypoplasia means defective development of both lungs. One may be more affected than the other, like in this case, which results in decreased weight, volume, and asyni for body weight and gestational age. The cause of which can be anything that compress the lung or impede the normal lung expansion in utero. As it is enumerated here, again, it is caused by anything that may impede the normal lung expansion in utero. The foregut cyst is another example of congenital anomalies. Foregut cysts are basically abnormal detachments of primitive foregut and are most often located at the hilum or middle mediastinum. Depending on the wall structure, these cysts are classified as follows. First is, of course, what we call as bronchogenic. This is an example of a bronchogenic cyst. It is rarely connected to the tracheobronchial tree. Microscopically, we are expecting that the cyst is lined by ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and the wall will also contain bronchial glands, cartilage, and smooth muscle. Usually, they present due to compression of nearby structures, or somewhat they are sometimes found incidentally. Another example of foregut cyst could be your enteric or esophageal cyst. But for our lecture, the typical example is, of course, bronchogenic, since we are talking about pulmonary pathology. When you say pulmonary sequestration, it refers to a discrete area of lung tissue which lacks any connection to the airway system, and it has an abnormal blood supply arising from the aorta or its branches. Extralobar sequestration and intralobar sequestration are the two types. From the term itself, when you say intra, it means it is embedded within the lung parenchyma. Extra, as you can see here, are external to the lung and most commonly come to attention in infants as mass lesions. They may be associated with other congenital anomalies. So intralobar, do not forget, occurs within the lung, and extralobar are external to the lung. Atelectasis, the C, I have placed it in caps lock here to remind you that atelectasis means compression or basically collapse. So the C here should remind you of the word collapse. There is incomplete expansion. This is what we call as neonatal atelectasis or collapse of a previously inflated lung. So again, atelectasis, the C should remind you of collapse. And this can be due to incomplete expansion as in neonatal atelectasis or collapse of a previously inflated lung, producing areas of relatively airless pulmonary parenchyma. So there are many types of atelectasis. The first on the list is what we call as resorption. Resorption stems from any obstruction of the airway. Resorption of oxygen trapped in the dependent alveoli would cause it to collapse. So this is an example of the area of atelectasis secondary to an obstruction. The obstruction may be in the form of mucus plug. It may be in the form of tumor, for example. The other one is what we call as compression. When you say compression, it is resulting from significant volume of fluid that occupies the pleural space. It may be in the form of a transudate, an exudate, or blood. It may also be in the form of air, like for example, in patients with pneumothorax. As fluid or air accumulates, it then compresses the lung parenchyma and causes atelectasis. The third one is what we call as contraction, or this is secondary to fibrosis. It is occurring when focal or generalized pulmonary or pleural fibrosis prevents the full lung expansion. So do not forget the three types: resorption, compression, and contraction. So the classic gross appearance of the lungs would be somewhat like this. As you can see, it is airless, it is non-crepitant, It is collapse. When you look at it under the microscope, you would see that this time the alveolar spaces are transformed into slit-like areas, such as seen in this illustration. When you talk of pulmonary edema, there are many causes, one of which is increased hydrostatic pressure, and this is often associated with left-sided heart failure, volume overload, or pulmonary vein obstruction. There are many causes. It may be, for example, long-standing, like in patients with mitral stenosis. This is an example of a lung parenchyma with pulmonary edema. As you can see in the illustration, this, as I have mentioned, is due to increased hydrostatic pressure. It is commonly occurring as a complication of left-sided heart failure. The frothing material that you see here is fluid accumulation. The fluid accumulation is initially in the basal region of the lower lobes. This is because this is the dependent area. So when you look at it under the microscope, the alveolar capillaries are engorged. And as you can see, there is pinkish deposit within the alveoli, or intra-alveolar cancellate. They appear as finely granular pale pink material. You may also see the presence of macrophages and which we actually call as hemosiderin-laden macrophages, or heart failure cells. In long-standing pulmonary congestion, for example, like in mitral stenosis, as I have said, they tend to be more abundant, and fibrosis is expected. There is thickening of the alveolar walls, which causes the lungs to be soggy and firm and brown, and this is what we call as brown induration. So this is a table directly lifted from your book, which categorizes the different causes of pulmonary edema. So the first would be hemodynamic. Again, the most common cause of which is left-sided heart failure. It can also be due to alveolar wall injury. When you say alveolar wall injury, this is what we refer to as non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema. It is due to injury of the alveolar septa. Primary injury to the vascular endothelium or damage to alveolar epithelial cells. It produces an inflammatory exudate that leaks into the interstitial space, and in more severe cases, into the alveoli. In most forms of pneumonia, the edema remains localized. When diffuse, however, alveolar edema is an important contributor to serious condition, which we refer to as ARDS. We're going to talk about that a little later. So again, in pulmonary edema, the lungs is expected to be heavy and wet. As you squeeze through it, as you can see in this illustration, the fluid oozes out of the cut surface. Histologically speaking, as I have mentioned, the alveolar capillaries are expected to be engorged. You see pink alveolar fluid within the alveoli. You may see alveolar macrophages, and this is what we call as heart failure cells. They tend to be abundant in long-standing cases. So ALI is otherwise known as acute lung injury. RDS stands for respiratory distress syndrome. DAD stands for diffuse alveolar damage. So these are all synonyms. They usually arise as complication of direct injury to the lung or systemic disorders. Clinically, they are characterized by rapid onset of severe life-threatening respiratory insufficiency, cyanosis, severe arterial hypoxemia, which is refractory to oxygen therapy, and may progress to extrapulmonary multisystem organ failure. So, as you can see here, there are different conditions associated. Let us talk about ALI. So ALI is associated with inflammation. The inflammation causes increased vascular permeability, edema, and epithelial cell death. So as you can see in the illustration, we have here the different inflammatory infiltrates. So the endothelial activation is an important event. Endothelial activation is secondary to pneumocyte injury. It is sensed by resident alveolar macrophages. In response, these secrete mediators, for example, such as tumor necrosis factor, that act on neighboring endothelium. Alternatively, circulating inflammatory mediators may activate the pulmonary endothelium and recruit other inflammatory cells to the site. The result then is recruitment and adhesion of leukocytes, causing more endothelial injury and local thrombosis. This cycle of inflammation and endothelial damage continues, and eventually you end up with ARDS. So the ARDS do have different stages. So the first one is what we call as organizing stage. In the organizing stage, the type 2 pneumocytes will proliferate. They will, granulation tissue formation is expected to be present. In most cases, the granulation tissue resolves, leaving minimal functional impairment. Sometimes, however, the fibrotic thickening of the alveolar septa ensues, and this then goes into the expected clinical course. So, clinical course of individuals who develop ALI are usually hospitalized for one of the predisposing conditions that is enumerated a while ago. You are expecting difficulty of breathing, tachypnea, which is followed by increasing cyanosis and hypoxemia. Respiratory failure is expected. When you do the X-ray, there is usually diffuse bilateral infiltrates on radiographic examination. Patients are usually unresponsive to oxygen therapy, and so hypoxemia and respiratory acidosis are expected to develop. Early in the course, the lungs become stiff due to loss of functional surfactant. So, the histologic examination of ALI or RDS is as follows. As you can see, we have a pink hyaline membrane lining the alveolar walls. They are usually seen, as you can see here, the alveoli is lined by pinkish hyaline membrane. They are representative of damaged type 2 pneumocytes. The macrophages, as I have said, gets to be activated and releases your mediators. So the endothelial damage and inflammatory cycle continues. So the epithelial restoration through proliferation of uninjured capillary endothelium is then expected to follow. So that is all about ALI. We're now going on the next part of the topic outline, which is the chronic non-infectious diffuse pulmonary diseases, which are categorized into two types. You have the obstructive and the restrictive. So let us first try to define obstructive lung diseases. When you say obstructive lung diseases, it is characterized by increase in resistance to airflow. Why? Because there is partial or complete obstruction at any level from the trachea and larger bronchi to the terminal and respiratory bronchioles. On the other hand, when you say restrictive, from the term itself, it is characterized by reduced expansion of the lung parenchyma and decreased total lung capacity. So, examples of obstructive lung diseases are enumerated. We are going to talk about that a little later, one by one. So this is an example of schematic representation of overlap between chronic obstructive lung diseases. So when you say obstructive lung diseases, the examples would be emphysema, bronchitis, and asthma. This is lumped together as what we call a COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It is defined by the WHO as a common, preventable, and treatable disease that is characterized by persistent respiratory symptoms and airflow limitation due to airway and/or alveolar abnormalities. So, the next is a table which is directly lifted from your book. This is a very important table because it gives you the different site of involvement expected in the different obstructive pulmonary diseases. So as you can see, at the level of the bronchus, when you think that it is bronchitis, bronchiectasis, or asthma, then the involvement would be at the level of the bronchus. When it is emphysema, we're talking about the sinus, and small airway disease, we're talking of the bronchioles. So there are different, these are what you will then expect histologically. And as you can see here, these are the different etiologic factors, the common culprit of which will be almost always smoking, and of course, infection for here, immunologic for asthma. So the presentation is expected to be cough, difficulty of breathing. The usual cause of death in COPD are as follows. The hypoxemia, as I have said, may lead to respiratory acidosis. It may go into a complication of right-sided heart failure, massive collapse of the lungs, secondary to pneumothorax. Now, the second is what we call as restrictive. When you say restrictive, again, it is associated with proportionate decrease in both total lung capacity and FEV1, leading to normal FEV1 FVC ratio. There are two categories. Number one would be chest wall disorders, and number two would be chronic interstitial and infiltrative diseases. So, category number one, again, and category number two. This is a table which actually compares obstructive versus restrictive lung disease. So, if you are the clinician, what are the things that you should do? First of course, is to do a pulmonary function test. The pulmonary function test, this is the expected result. And then, of course, it is a must that you have completed the history taking and physical examination. From there, you're able to deduce whatever is the etiology of the case. So do not forget history, PE, pulmonary function test, and try to look for associated disorders. Now, let us take a look at it again, this time discussing it in a more detailed manner. So this is an example of an illustration of a patient with asthma. Asthma is characteristically chronic. It is a problem of the conducting airways. It is often an immunological reaction. It is marked by episodic bronchoconstriction, which is due to increased airway sensitivity. Inflammation of the bronchial wall is also expected and increased mucus secretion. So if you're following what I'm trying to say, to compare the lumen, so that's the first characteristic, bronchoconstriction. Number two, as I have mentioned, expected inflammation. So somewhat the wall, as you can see here, is more thickened. And of course, the yellow material inside is the third component, which is increased mucus secretion. This then leads to the expected clinical manifestation, which will be recurrent episodes of wheezing, breathlessness, chest tightness, and even cough, usually triggered by an allergic immune response. But bear in mind that asthma can be immunologic, which is again, do not forget, bronchoconstriction, increased airway sensitivity, inflammation, and mucus secretion. So as I have mentioned, it may be triggered by immunologic reaction. However, there are also other causes, like as you can see here, these are examples of non-atopic asthma or triggers, like for example, it may be seasonal, it may be exercise-induced, It may be secondary to drugs. For example, it may also be occupational, like for example, smoke exposure to fumes, exercise. So these are other etiologic agents of asthma. So here I tried to tabulate the difference between atopic versus non-atopic asthma. So from atopic, it is usually immune-mediated, and do not forget the involvement of IgE, immunoglobulin E. It is a hypersensitivity reaction. The classic history is that your patient usually have it since childhood, and the attack is triggered by environmental allergens. The usual course also it is running in the family. So there is positive family history. If you do a skin test, it will immediately result in a will and flare reaction. On the other hand, the non-atopic asthma do not have evidence of allergen sensitization, and so the skin test is usually negative. Unlike atopic, the history here of family is less common. Respiratory infections due to viruses are usually the common trigger for non-atopic asthma. So let us try to see what happens in asthmatic patient. So in asthmatic patient, atopic asthma is caused by a T helper 2 and IgE response to environmental allergens in genetically predisposed individuals. That's why, as I have said, it is often arising on a background of familial history. Airway inflammation is central to disease pathophysiology, and it causes airway dysfunction due to the release of inflammatory mediators, and partly through remodeling of the airway wall. As the disease becomes severe, there is increased local secretion of growth factors. It induces then mucus gland hypertrophy, smooth muscle proliferation, angiogenesis, fibrosis, and even nerve proliferation. So if we're going to talk about, again, the pathophysiology, this table is a comparison of a normal airway and that of a patient with asthma. The asthmatic airway, as you can see, is marked by accumulation of mucus in the bronchial lumen, secondary to increased number of mucin-secreting goblet cells and hypertrophy of the submucosal glands. Inflammatory infiltrates due to recruitment of eosinophils, macrophages, is also expected. The basement membrane is expected to be thickened, and there is hypertrophy and hyperplasia of the smooth muscle cells. Inhaled allergens triggers the T helper 2 dominant response, which will then favor IgE production and eosinophil recruitment. As you can see in illustration D, on re-exposure to antigen, the immediate reaction is triggered by antigen-induced cross-linking of IgE bound to Fc receptors on mast cells. These cells will then release preformed mediators because you have, again, it is caused by a trigger, environmental exposure. So the mediators are expected to be preformed that directly and via neuronal reflexes will now induce bronchospasm. Bronchospasm, as I have mentioned, will be accompanied by increased vascular permeability, recruiting leukocytes further to the site of injury. Mucus production, as I have said, is an expected sequelae. On illustration E, leukocytes recruited to the site of reaction. As you can see there, it's a mixture of neutro, AO, basal, lymphocytes, and monocytes will release additional mediators, which will initiate the late phase of asthma. Several factors are released from eosinophils. The ones most notable mentioned in your book would be your major basic protein and eosinophilic cationic protein, which will cause further damage in the endothelium. So, the pathogenesis, again, T helper 2, IgE, the repeated airway inflammation would cause airway dysfunction, and this is what I have said as airway remodeling. In severe diseases, you are expecting that the patient will have secretion, mucous gland hypertrophy, smooth muscle proliferation, angiogenesis, fibrosis, and nerve proliferation, as I have said. So again, for re-exposure, the exposure on re-exposure to antigen would lead to immediate reaction triggered by antigen-induced cross-linking of IgE bound to Fc receptors on mast cells. This will then release preformed mediators, and the expected would be bronchoconstriction. So we have again the early phase mediators, and the effects of which it is dominated by bronchoconstriction, increased mucus production, vasodilatation, and increased vascular permeability. Again, it is triggered by direct stimulation of subepithelial, vagal, parasympathetic receptors through both central and local reflexes. Atopic asthma can also have late phase reaction, and late phase reaction is dominated by recruitment of leukocytes, notably eosinophils, neutrophils, and T cells. So this is an illustration of our microscopic examination, and as you can see here, you have a lot of eosinophils in the parenchyma. So let us try to run down the different mediators. So the mediators for bronchospasm would be your leukotrienes, your acetylcholine. There are many mediators produced by leukocytes and epithelial cells. These are what we call as suspects, and they are actually ranked in your book based on clinical efficacy of pharmacologic intervention with antagonists of specific mediators. The next one would be your mediators, which includes or present at the scene of the crime, but whose actual role in acute allergic asthma seems to be relatively minor on the lack of efficacy of potent antagonist or synthesis inhibitors. So they are as follows. You have your histamine, you have your prostaglandin D2, and you have your platelet activating factor. And then the third is a large group of mediators, which we call as suspects. When you say suspects, they are for whom specific antagonists or inhibitors are not yet available or have been insufficiently studied. Several promising focused therapies for asthma that target interleukin 13, 14 signal transduction pathways are in development, including anti-interleukin 13 monoclonal antibodies and interleukin-4 receptor antagonists. Other targets would include interleukin-1, tumor necrosis factor, interleukin-6, chemokines, neuropeptides, nitric oxide, bradykinin, and endothelin. So, I have already mentioned airway remodeling. What does it mean? It means that your wall, as I have shown you the illustration before, gets to be thickened. Why? Because there is fibrosis, there is increased vascularity, the submucosal glands are also expected to be increased in number, and there is hypertrophy of your bronchial wall. Now, this is again a repeat illustration showing you the things to remember. 1, bronchoconstriction. 2, thickening of the wall. And 3, mucus production. So, drug-induced asthma, there are several pharmacologic agents as you can see, that may provoke asthma. One of which is aspirin. Aspirin-sensitive asthma is an uncommon type. It occurs in individuals usually with recurrent rhinitis and nasal polyp. These individuals are exquisitely sensitive to small doses of aspirin, as well as other non-steroidal anti-inflammatory medication. They can also have urticaria as part of their manifestation. Occupational asthma, which is the second category, this form of asthma may be triggered by fumes, like for example, plastic, epoxy resins, organic and chemical dust, gases, and other chemicals like for example, formaldehyde and penicillin. So when you do an autopsy of a patient with asthma, it seems like that the chest wall or the lung is basically coming out of the chest wall. The usual is what we call as status asthmaticus. These are patients dying of acute severe asthma. Characteristically, one of the most striking finding would be that the airways are filled with mucus. So this is an example of an airway filled with thick mucus plug illustrated. So this again is due to increased size of the submucosal glands, and hypertrophy and hyperplasia would then lead to copious amount of thick mucus plug that occludes the airway. Sometimes you can even pull it out like this, and the shape of which actually follows the bronchi up to the level of the bronchioles. So the classic acute asthmatic attack can last up to several hours. In some patients, the usual symptom would be chest tightness, dyspnea, wheezing, and coughing. Usually, as I have mentioned, the most severe form is what we call as status asthmaticus, and it may lead to the demise of the patient. The other things that we can actually look for as pathologists would be examination of the mucus plug, which under the microscope may show you these different structures. On the left is what we call as Kirchmann spirals, and this on the right is what we call as Charcot-Leyden crystals. These are usually seen among patients with atopic asthma. So again, eosinophils, as you can see better here on this side, are expected accompaniment, particularly if it is triggered by an allergic attack. Okay, so that concludes the discussion of asthma. I'm now going to emphysema. When you say emphysema, this time I want you to remember the letter E. The E here should remind you of enlargement of air spaces. Enlargement of air spaces. There are different types of emphysema, and the usual cause of which is smoking. This is the classic appearance of your patient. They are usually barrel-chested, they are dyspneic, they usually are having a hunched over position and tends to sit forward. Now, this table differentiates the types of emphysema. When you say centri-acinar, otherwise known as centrilobular, from the term itself, the centri tells you that the involvement is in the central or proximal parts of the acinar. It is formed by respiratory bronchioles, and the distal alveoli are spared. Thus, both emphysematous and normal air spaces exist within the same acinus and lobule. Panacinar, on the other hand, in this type, the acini are uniformly enlarged from the level of the respiratory bronchiole to the terminal blind alveoli. The prefix pan should remind you that it refers to the entire acinus, not the entire lung, entire acinus. In contrast to centri-acinar emphysema, pan-acinar emphysema tends to occur more commonly in the lower zones and in the anterior margins of the lungs, and it is usually most severe at the bases. The third category is what we call as distal acinar, otherwise known as paraseptal. Here, the proximal portion of the acinus is normal and the distal part is predominantly involved. The emphysema is more striking adjacent to the pleura, along the lobular connective tissue septa and at the margin of the lobules. Air space enlargement with fibrosis leads to what we call as the fourth category, which is irregular emphysema. Irregular emphysema is so named because the acinus is irregularly involved. It almost invariably is associated with scarring. In most instances, it occurs as a small foci and clinically insignificant. So, this is an illustration again of emphysema. Do not forget that E should remind you of enlargement of air spaces distal to the terminal bronchiole. And I have already enumerated the four major types: centriacinar, panacinar, distal acinar, and irregular. So this is an illustration showing you the morphology. So we are expecting that the lungs would be voluminous. They will have abnormally large alveoli, which is separated by thin septa. And as you can see here, the enlargement is very much evident. Sometimes it may fuse. As it fuses, it forms what you call as bullae. So this is an example of bullae or bullous emphysema. It is, for this patient, located in the upper left lobe of the lungs. So, what causes emphysema? I already told you a while ago that it is often associated with smoking. So, inhaled cigarette smoke and other noxious particles which causes lung damage and inflammation. It will then lead to parenchymal destruction and airway disease. Factors that influence the development of emphysema would include the following: inflammatory mediators and leukocytes. There is a wide variety of inflammatory mediators and leukocytes implicated. The usual would be leukotriene B4, interleukin 8, tumor necrosis factors. We also have what we call as protease, anti-protease imbalance, and oxidative stress. Now, let us try to take it up one by one. So when you say protease, anti-protease imbalance, several proteases are released from the inflammatory cells and epithelial cells, which break down the connective tissue components. In patients who develop emphysema, there is a relative deficiency of protective anti-proteases, which in some cases will have a genetic basis. So there are two things that you should remember here. Elastase are released from the inflammatory cells. Okay. You are supposed to have inherent mechanism which will act against the elastase, and this is what we call as the anti-elastase. If you are a smoker, it tips off the balance, favoring high protease activity. So meaning elastase predominates. Now, as I have said, the protease or the elastase predominates. Why? The substances in the tobacco smoke, alveolar damage, will cause the inflammatory cells to produce oxidants, which then leads to tissue damage and inflammation. The role of oxidants is actually supported by a mouse model in which the NRF2 gene is inactivated. NRF2 encodes a transcription factor that serves as a sensor for oxidants in alveolar epithelial cells and many other cell types. Intracellular oxidants activate NRF2. It upregulates the expression of multiple genes that protect cells from the oxidant damage. Mice without NRF2 are significantly more sensitive to tobacco smoke than normal mice, and genetic variants in NRF2 or NRF2 regulators and NRF2 target genes are all associated with smoking-related lung disease in humans. So, this is an illustration which is not in your book, but I find it very useful for students to understand what I'm trying to say. So the idea is that proteases are important. It is based on, it is actually supposed to be tipping off the balance so that you have more of elastase and the anti-proteases, thereby leading to destruction or enlargement of air spaces. It is basically because the elastin framework is the one that is acted upon. Now, there are different types of emphysema. You have congenital lobar overinflation in infants. Hypoplasia of bronchial cartilage and sometimes associated with congenital cardiac or lung abnormalities, creating what we call as the ball valve effect. What do you mean by ball valve effect? In here, the air enters on inspiration, but it cannot leave on expiration. So obstructive overinflation, in this condition, the lung expands because air is trapped within it. There are other causes of emphysema also. Bullous emphysema, I have shown you the illustration a while ago. It is a descriptive term to tell you that there are already large subpleural blebs, the diameter of which may range from more than 1 centimeter in greatest dimension. When you say interstitial emphysema, entrance of air into the connective tissue stroma of the lung, mediastinum, or subcutaneous tissue produces interstitial emphysema. In most instances, the alveolar tears in pulmonary emphysema provides the avenue of entrance of air into the stroma of the lung. For example, chest wound that allow entry of air or fractured ribs that puncture the lung substance are scenarios which may eventually lead to interstitial emphysema. So take a look at this microscopic illustration. So as I have said, it is expected that the alveoli is enlarged. It is accompanied by destruction of the alveolar walls. So the abnormally large alveoli is separated by thin septa, and usually there is destruction of the alveolar walls accompanying it. So how do you diagnose your patient again? I've shown you the classic physical appearance of the patient. You are to expect, of course, dyspnea, cough, wheezing. History taking would tell you that these patients are classically smoker. You can do spirometry studies again, and the impaired expiratory airflow is the expected finding. So, emphysema clinical course, the cause of death is often as follows. In patients with severe emphysema, they may develop respiratory failure, right-sided heart failure, massive collapse of the lungs, which may be due to pneumothorax. The treatment options are as enumerated. Okay. The next on the list would be chronic bronchitis. So to diagnose chronic bronchitis, again, start with history taking. Usually, it is giving you a history of productive cough for at least 3 consecutive months in at least 2 consecutive years in the absence of any other identifiable cause. So the cough is what you should look for, and again, the duration of the cough. Now, these are the different categories. It may be simple chronic bronchitis, chronic asthmatic, or obstructive chronic bronchitis. What is happening in bronchitis? Just like emphysema, the primary or initiating factor is exposure to nauseous or irritating inhaled substances, like for example, tobacco. Again, it is present in 90% of cases. They are usually smokers. Just like what I have discussed in asthma, mucus hypersecretion is an expected accompaniment. The earliest feature of chronic bronchitis is hypersecretion of mucus in the large airways. This is associated with hypertrophy of the submucosal glands. So as you can see in this illustration, the mucus hypersecretion is evident. This is due to hypertrophy of the submucosal glands. As pathologists, we usually try to measure that, and this is what we call as the RAID index. This index is actually telling us the ratio of the thickness of the mucus gland layer to the thickness of the wall between the epithelium and the cartilage. As I have mentioned, the mucus hypersecretion is due to hyperplasia of your submucosal glands. So what do you expect to see? Inflammation is very much evident. The inhalants that induce chronic bronchitis will cause cellular damage. It will elicit both acute and chronic inflammatory responses, and it will involve neutrophils, lymphocytes, and macrophages. Long-standing inflammation may accompany fibrosis, and it may involve smaller airways as well. So infection usually does not initiate chronic bronchitis, but is probably significant in maintaining it and may be critical in producing acute exacerbation. So this is an example of what I am trying to explain. So again, in the morphologic findings, characteristically, you will see inflammatory infiltrates, chronic at that, so meaning predominance of lymphocytes and macrophages. You have enlargement of mucus-secreting glands. Mucus hyperplasia is expected. Do not forget the RAID index. It is, again, an increased ratio of the thickness of the mucus gland to the thickness of the wall. It is normally around 0.4, and it is expected to be increased in patients with chronic bronchitis. So, sometimes you will tend to see an overlap among your patient. Like, for example, emphysema and bronchitis. So, they can actually coexist. However, depending on the enumerated expected clinical manifestation here, you can actually tell whether your patient is having predominantly bronchitis or predominantly emphysema. So we go now to the next topic, which is bronchiectasis. When you say bronchiectasis, again, the bronchi here should tell you that the involvement is at the level of the bronchi and bronchioles. This time, the term to remember is dilatation. So you have dilatation of the bronchi and the bronchioles. Why? Because there is destruction of the smooth muscle and elastic tissue. It is often caused by necrotizing infection, which causes permanent dilatation of your bronchi and bronchioles. However, as you can see, there are other variety of conditions that is also associated with it. So let's talk about the pathogenesis. So for example, in cystic fibrosis, there is impaired secretion of chloride ions into mucus, low sodium and water content. The usual is we have two terms to remember. That's obstruction and infection. When you have bronchial obstruction, the normal clearing mechanisms are impaired. And when this happens, it results in pooling of secretions distal to the obstruction with secondary infection and inflammation. The severe infection of the bronchi will lead to inflammation, often accompanied with necrosis, fibrosis, and eventual dilatation of the airways. In primary ciliary dyskinesia, this is an autosomal recessive syndrome. It has a frequency of around 1 in 15,000 to 40,000 births. The ciliary dysfunction will cause defect in ciliary motor protein. Usually, it is mutation involving dynein. It contributes to retention of secretion and recurrent infection, thereby leading to bronchiectasis. So do not forget, obstruction and superimposed infection are the key terms to remember. For example, among patients with, another one is allergic bronchopulmonary aspergillosis. This usually occurs in patients with asthma and cystic fibrosis who develop periods of exacerbation and remission, which may again eventually lead to proximal bronchiectasis and fibrotic lung disease. It is resulting from hypersensitivity reaction, as you can see, to Aspergillus fumigatus. Sensitization to Aspergillus in the allergic host leads to activation of T helper 2 cells, which plays a role in recruiting eosinophils and other leukocytes. So, when you look at the lung, it usually affects the lower lobes, bilateral at that. It is most severe in the more distal bronchi and bronchioles. It is usually causing dilatation to up to 4 times the normal size. So that when you take a look at it grossly, as you can see here, it is easily recognizable. For the histologic findings, it may vary with the activity or chronicity of the disease. So in the histologic findings, again, it may vary with the chronicity of the disease. In full-blown active cases, you may see active inflammatory infiltrates, acute and chronic at that, with exudation of the walls of the bronchi and the bronchioles. But of course, as you can see that the airways here are dilated, you are expecting it also to be seen microscopically. So this is an example of a dilated bronchiole. Usually, it is characteristically, as I have mentioned, enlarged to approximately around more than 4 times the usual size. So what do we expect among patients with bronchiectasis? Again, you will expect cough. You will have dyspnea or topnia. Sometimes it may even lead to manifestations like hemoptysis. The complication, as enumerated, may be in the form of cor pulmonale, brain abscess, amyloidosis. So, let's now move to the next topic, but I'm going to give you a 5-minute break before we proceed to interstitial lung disease.